Even though we are on Zoom and things may feel a little bit different than normal this year, History Homecoming 2021 will actually feature the same two basic elements that mark this event every year. First, I, as chair, will say a few words about the state of the Cal History Department. And second, and much more importantly, I think, a panel of faculty will make short and entertaining presentations and answer questions in a learned and witty way on a common historical theme. What is different this year is that these elements will not be followed by our normal buffet spread and open bar. Sorry about that. So you should feel free to raid the fridge and or the liquor cabinet wherever you happen to be during the course of our 90 minutes together. Regarding the state of the department, well, I'm not going to sugarcoat it. It's been a pretty difficult year since our last History Homecoming in February of 2020. We've spent way too many hours on Zoom. We've been fairly isolated from our colleagues and our students. Many of us have abruptly taken on heavy child care burdens and other family duties as a result of the pandemic. Research and almost all research-related travel, as you can imagine, has been put on hold. I've never experienced a year quite like this in 35 years in academia. It's really been historic, and I think it's fair to say it's been historically tough. But nevertheless, the Cal History Department has persevered. We have staged this year a full curriculum, including 75 lecture classes and dozens of undergraduate and graduate seminars. We've continued to support roughly 100 PhD students completing their coursework and writing their dissertations. Even though it's been hard to do research, especially archival and library research, it has been possible to write, and department members have continued to produce excellent scholarship, essays, and reviews during this period. The cutting edge work of faculty members has been recognized this year by a raft of book prizes and awards, including the LA Times Book Prize, the Bryce Wood Award in Latin American Studies, and the National Jewish Book Award, just to name a few. Despite a challenging, to say the least, job market for PhDs, we're actually really pleased to have placed 13 of our graduates in tenure track post and 9 more in postdoctoral fellowship positions. We're also really pleased to have been able to successfully recruit 2 talented historians to join our faculty, Puck Engman, a specialist in Maoist China, and Stacy Van Vliet, a historian of Central Asia, a field that the department hasn't covered for some time. Finally, we're happy to have continued and in some cases intensified our work to promote the professional development of our students and to advance diversity, equity, and inclusion in our department. Of particular note, I think, is an elaborate website on the history of women in the Berkeley History Department that we launched in the fall, thanks to the leadership and really hard work of Professor Emeritus Beth Berry. And I also want to mention the History PhD Pipeline Program, an initiative funded by Grad Division to support graduate school applicants from underrepresented backgrounds that has been led this year by a terrific team, including Waldo Martin, Aaron Inama, Mahel Hamroon, and Jordan Mersina. So in short, although we have faced pretty significant challenges, the Cal History Department has hung in there, continued to move forward, and I'm confident that we are going to find renewed strength and health as we move out of this period of the high pandemic and towards greater normality in the fall. In conclusion, I want to briefly shout out members of History's wonderful staff who have helped organize both this particular event, but also all of our operations during the straitened circumstances of this year. I want to thank Marianne Bartholomew Kautz, Kim Bissell, Leah Flanagan, Janet Flores, Jan Haas, David Harris, Aaron Inama, Ken Maru, Laura Marastika, Robbie Powers, and Maya Cisneros. Please everyone out there join me in giving them a virtual round of applause. We really appreciate you guys. Turning now to our panel, this year's theme, perhaps not surprisingly, is Plagues and Pandemics, Invisible Disasters That Shaped History. And for your edification and your listening pleasure, we present three Berkeley historians who hopefully will show how the study of plagues and pandemics in the past can help to illuminate some of the dynamics shaping the current COVID-19 crisis. What I'd like to do now is to introduce our three panelists right off the top, so I won't be interrupting their presentations with long introductions later. Following their three presentations, I'll moderate an extended question and answer session. Some people have already posed questions to us via email, but if you have questions that come up during the presentation, you can send them to us through the chat and we'll scan them, and if we have time, we'll add them to the roster of questions. But let me now just briefly introduce our panelists and then we'll get started. Our first panelist today is Carlos Noreña, a historian of the Roman world. Carlos's research interests include the political and cultural history of the period 200 BCE to 400 CE, the historical geography of the Roman Empire, and comparative ancient empires. Carlos is the author of a study of the Roman emperor as a unifying symbol for the Western Empire entitled Imperial Ideals in the Roman West, Representation, Circulation, Power. He's currently working on several books, including one on the relationship between law, imperialism, and political culture in the Middle and Late Roman Republic. Today, Carlos is going to talk about several of the most famous plagues in classical antiquity, including the Plague of Athens, the Antonine Plague, and the Plague of Cyprian. Our second panelist, Geoff Koziol, is a historian of medieval Europe. Geoff's research interests include politics, ritual, monasticism, religious discourse, diplomacy, and historiography in the late Carolingian and Capetian France. He teaches Western Civ, the upper division sequence, Europe in the early Middle Ages and Europe in the later Middle Ages, as well as the intriguingly titled undergraduate seminar, How Does Ritual Mean? He is the author of several books, including most recently, The Peace of God, a study of a prominent religious peace movement during the 10th and 11th centuries. In his talk today, Geoff will reflect upon the huge literature addressing the history of the Black Death during the 14th and 15th centuries. Finally, Elena Schneider is a historian of Latin American, the Caribbean, and the Atlantic world. Her research focuses on Cuba and the Caribbean, comparative colonialism, and slavery. Her first book, The Occupation of Havana, won 5 major book awards last year, including the Raleigh Prize in Atlantic History from the AHA, and 4 others. She's currently working on a study of maritime marinage in the 18th century Caribbean and the relationship between African and indigenous slavery in the Spanish Empire. Today, she's going to talk about the most recent scholarship on smallpox and the Columbian encounter. Okay, so there are our introductions, and let me now turn the lighted square over to Carlos, whose talk is entitled Plagues, Predicaments, and the First Fall of the Roman Empire. Carlos?
Okay, Peter, thank you so much, and welcome to everybody. Let me just do this first. Peter, can you see my screen?
It's clear, yep.
Yep, okay, so here we go. So sometimes I'm asked why it is that I chose ancient history as my field. And it's because I knew that, for the rest of my career, when I was presenting alongside my colleagues, I would always get to go first. So Plagues, Predicaments, and the First Fall of the Roman Empire. When I was invited to speak on the panel, I was in a kind of ambitious frame of mind. And so I decided, well, why don't I challenge Gibbon, which is about as high a bar as can be set, I think, for a Roman historian. So Gibbon, of course, the author of a 6-volume masterwork of 18th century historiography, which has been identified by Arnaldo Momigliano as the first modern work of history, tracing the history of the decline and fall of the Roman Empire. Gibbon gives a long-term account of that process, but he really locates the fall of the empire, as is now conventional, in the 5th century CE. Just to orient everybody, I've put here 3 maps that show over time the progressive disintegration of the Roman Empire from the late 4th century, when it in fact had already been split into 2 halves for administrative purposes, into the mid 5th century, when it's beginning to fragment and shrink around its perimeters, and then into the early 6th century, when at least the western half of the empire has disappeared entirely to be replaced by what we sometimes call successor states ruled by Germanic kings. Now, Gibbon talks about many different features of this process. He gives a particularly prominent role to Christianity, but chronologically, this is really the core of Gibbon's account, highlighting the 5th century as the period of the fall. Now, he begins his survey at this period, the 2nd century CE. This is the height of the Roman Empire. This is when the Roman Empire reaches its greatest extent. And this is on any number of metrics, the golden age of the Roman Empire, the height of the Roman Empire. Now, my argument today is going to be that it was actually this empire that you're looking at here that fell. That even before Gibbon takes up his account of the fall of the empire, I'm going to propose that the Roman Empire had already fallen once in the mid 3rd century CE, and that one of the primary causes of that first fall was a pandemic that has been largely forgotten by history and has only recently become an object of scholarly investigation. Now, one way to contextualize my presentation is to observe that the last generation of scholarship on the ancient Mediterranean world has seen tremendous gains in the history of demography and the human life cycle, and on the various disease profiles of the ancient Mediterranean. So for example, we now know, and we can now chart fairly precisely, what has been called the seasonality of death in Rome. We have good documentary evidence, both from Rome itself and from Egypt, and that evidence converges, which is helpful. And we can chart the monthly rates of death for both males and females. And what you can see is a big peak in the summer months of August, September, and October. And this is, we think, and are pretty sure, the product of the ravages of malaria, which hits especially hard in the late summer. Now, what you're looking at here is a chart which measures the effects of endemic disease in the ancient Mediterranean. And that's one thing. Plague and pandemic, of course, is something else. A pandemic is a major death event, not at a local scale, but at a regional or even transcontinental scale. That's what I want to talk about today. Now, these here are probably the 3 best known plagues from the ancient Mediterranean. The plague in the city of Athens in the 5th century BC, an important part of the Peloponnesian War as recorded by Thucydides. Then the Antonine Plague of the 2nd century, right in the middle of that golden age that I just mentioned. And then indeed, probably the most famous of them all, the one that makes it into kind of general trade books, the Justinianic Plague of the 6th century. So now I've done my due diligence. As promised, I've at least referred to these three, but I'm going to talk about a different one, one that's actually not so famous, hasn't been so much discussed, namely the Plague of Cyprian from the 250s. And what I want to do is first contextualize that plague in the context of the breakdown of order in the Roman Empire in the 3rd century, then talk about the Plague of Cyprian itself, what we know about it, and then conclude with my argument about the role of that plague in what I'm going to call here, maybe a little boldly, the first fall of the Roman Empire. Now, in the conventional periodization of Roman history, or Roman imperial history, we make a distinction between the early or high empire of the first 2 centuries CE and the later Roman Empire of the 3rd, 4th, and 5th centuries CE. But between these two major periods was a 50-year transitional period from 235 to 284, known as the 3rd century crisis. And a crisis it certainly was. And it was characterized by, among other things, acute political instability, which represents a real contrast with what came before and after. It's a period that witnesses a bewildering number of emperors and usurpers, and it's often hard to distinguish between the two. The average length of an imperial reign in the 3rd century is 2 to 3 years. And every single emperor in the 3rd century crisis, but one, died by violence. And the one who didn't die by violence died of the plague. It's also characterized by continuous warfare, not only chronic civil war between these many contenders for the imperial throne, but also large-scale simultaneous invasions of the empire along the northern frontier, defined by the Rhine and Danube rivers, and the eastern frontier. The period witnesses economic decline. We can measure a real decrease in total output, a debasement of the currency, and rampant inflation. And there is also fiscal collapse. With that lower total output, there is a much shrunken tax base for the Roman state to collect revenues. And these problems were all interrelated, and they compounded one another. I'll just show you 3 kind of reflections of crisis. The first is a very famous image. This is a rock carving near Persepolis in modern Iran, showing the Roman emperor on his knees in a position of abject submission to the Persian king, Shapur I, who had defeated him in battle. And this is a very kind of evocative image of Roman subordination to Persian power, which would have been unthinkable in previous centuries. Equally unthinkable in previous centuries was this, the Aurelianic Wall in the city of Rome. This is not for show. The Aurelianic Wall is a major wall, a defensive network of the whole capital city, which again would have been inconceivable in earlier centuries. To think that the capital of the Roman Empire would need protection would be insane, but there it is in the 3rd century. And we can also trace in some detail the debasement of the Roman currency. The Roman state is running low on metals, and so it starts putting less and less silver into its silver coins and less gold into its gold coins. And the result of all of these interlocking problems is a major fragmentation of the empire, where you can see on this map, which really should have sharper differentiated colors than it does. But anyway, you can see that the empire in the east and the west is actually falling apart. So I think this very much justifies the term crisis. Now, in the great timing category, I offer you the following. It was in the middle of all of that breakdown that the Roman Empire was hit by a devastating pandemic, the Plague of Cyprian. Here I'm going to be drawing on a wonderful recent book by a colleague, Kyle Harper, Climate, Disease, and the End of an Empire, The Fate of Rome. This is a big kind of large-scale study of climate and disease in the Roman world. Readers of the New York Times might recognize the name. He recently wrote an op-ed on what the Antonine Plague can teach us about the current pandemic. Now, our plague of Cyprian, takes its name from Cyprian. He's a North African. He's from Carthage. He converted to Christianity around 245, but he rose very quickly from that point to become the bishop of Carthage, the second biggest city in the Western Empire after Rome. He held that position from 248 to 258, when he was executed in the persecution of the Emperor Valerian, the same Valerian, who would later be captured by Shapur I, and he was martyred in that process. But he writes at great length about the plague, and so his name has become attached to it. It's a plague that Harper called, quote, a transcontinental disease event of rare magnitude. Here's a map showing places where we have evidence and indication of the plague. So it's an empire-wide affair. And if you're wondering about the absence of my very dramatic red thunderbolts from the West, that's because there just is no evidence at all. So it was probably even worse there. Now, the literary tradition tells us that the plague arrived into the Roman Empire from Ethiopia, which recalls a little bit Thucydides' account of the plague in Athens. So there's some suspicion that this might be a kind of literary prototype, but there actually is some evidence for that directionality. We have discovered from the mid-3rd century a mass grave in the Egyptian city of Thebes with a kind of elaborate body disposal operation with purpose-built lime kilns employed to pour lime over the bodies, which were then incinerated. So we have no other evidence for that mass burial, but something has terrified those people. The first literary account we get of this plague comes from the Bishop of Alexandria in 249, and then we get further documentary evidence from the city of Rome in 251. So where we can piece the development, it does confirm a movement from the southeast to the northwest. Now, contemporary sources suggest that the plague lasted for 15 years, with the 150s seeming to be, the 250s, the period of most intense activity. The contemporary sources indicate that it hit hardest in the winter months. Now, that's going to be important. The winter seasonality of the Plague of Cyprian distinguishes it from the regular disease pattern of the ancient Mediterranean. The demographic impact of the plague is impossible to measure because the evidence from the 3rd century is very scattered. But just to give you an order of magnitude, estimates for the demographic effects of the Antonine Plague from the 2nd century run as high as 25% of the imperial population. So this is a major death event. Now, it's from Cyprian, who talks about this plague, that we can reconstruct the basic pathology. So I'm going to read to you a passage, and I warn you now, this is quite graphic. He says, "These are adduced as proof of faith, that as the strength of the body is dissolved, the bowels dissipate in a flow, that a fire that begins in the inmost depths burns up into wounds in the throat, that the intestines are shaken with continuous vomiting, that the eyes are set on fire from the force of the blood, that the infection of deadly putrefaction cuts off the feet or other extremities of some, and that as weakness prevails through the failures and losses of the bodies, the gait is crippled, or the hearing is blocked, or the vision is blinded. And indeed, other sources beyond Cyprian confirm this basic pathology of fatigue, bloody stool, fever, esophageal lesions, vomiting, conjunctival hemorrhaging, the infection of the extremities, loss of hearing, and blindness. And what both Cyprian and the contemporary sources also highlight is the rapid onset of the disease. So this brings us to a key question. What caused it? What was the pathogen behind the plague of Cyprian? Now, that's not easy to answer. We're trying to offer here a retroactive diagnosis of a complex disease on the basis of passages like this. But let's try it anyway. It has to be something capable of empire-wide destruction. Now, the pathology and the seasonality seem to rule out bubonic plague, cholera, typhus, and measles. Another possibility is smallpox. We think that it was smallpox that caused the Antonine Plague, but we have no account from the plague of Cyprian of the full body rash that seems to be a diagnostic marker of smallpox. Now, Harper suggests two possibilities, either a pandemic influenza or a viral hemorrhagic fever. Several features of the pathology fit the pandemic influenza diagnosis, but one key one is missing. There's no evidence of respiratory symptoms. Maybe it's a flavivirus, namely the thing that causes yellow fever and dengue fever. That's normally caused by mosquitoes and is characterized by a slow onset. So that seems to run counter to the plague of Cyprian. What about an arenavirus like the Lassa fever? That's caused by rodents, but the speed of transmission is slower than what we think we can reconstruct for the plague of Cyprian. And the best fit actually seems to be that it was a filovirus. All the various indicators would point in that direction. That's the same pathogen that causes Ebola. So perhaps we can think of the plague of Cyprian as an ancient sweep of Ebola. Now, just to conclude, is there really a connection between the plague of Cyprian and the 3rd century crisis? I would say that there was, because the problems that I sketched before weren't just interrelated, but they compounded one another, and they were all intensified by the plague. Simultaneous warfare on multiple frontiers required many troops in action. And that was expensive. The expense of multiple campaigns strained the imperial budget, which was already reeling from the drop-off in new sources of revenue. And both of those problems were made much worse by the plague, which devastated the imperial population, reduced the tax base from which the state could collect revenues, and reduced the number of active soldiers. So I would suggest that the plague of Cyprian was the straw that broke the camel's back, and that the empire fragments as a result, and that when the Roman Empire is rebuilt in the 3rd century by Diocletian and Constantine, Rome's first Christian emperor, this new Roman Empire, this Roman Empire 2.0, was so different from what came before that one might legitimately ask, was there really a Roman Empire in the mid-3rd century? I want to suggest that the answer is no, that the Roman Empire disappeared in the context of the plague of Cyprian. So that what Gibbon was really recounting to us was not quite the fall of the Roman Empire, but the second fall of the Roman Empire. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Carlos. That was terrific. Let me now turn the podium, the virtual podium, over to Geoff Koziol. Geoff's presentation is entitled Recent Discoveries and New Perspectives on the Black Death. Geoff?
Thank you. I assume everyone can hear me. I hope I managed to get to most of the items that are listed on the right of your screen, on the right of this slide, but I may not. We'll see. I'll edit as I go. In particular, I may not get to the effects. This one here, which I'm really quite eager to, but I will try. In trying to get to them, I may deal somewhat superficially with issues that you may be particularly interested in, and I hope we can deal with those issues during the Q&A period. The reason I want to cover so much is because our understanding of the plague has changed dramatically just over the last 10 years, since 2011. And indeed, a major article was published just last January in 2020 that overturns a longstanding legend, which now can go into the realm of mythology. It's another reason that I want to deal with a number of issues, because the Black Death is an event of almost mythic importance in European history. And I mean that mythic importance literally, because it has given rise to a great many myths. And so there's so many aspects to deal with that you may or may not be familiar with, or I should say perhaps some of the things that you think are you're maybe most certain of, maybe the very issues that have been most recently called into question. So I do want to cover a fair amount of ground here. I should mention that I could subtitle this talk, the more we know what we don't know, because that is absolutely true, despite the fact that our understanding both of the pathogen that causes the plague and the course of the plague in the Middle Ages has changed so dramatically and improved and gained granular detail in so many different respects. Every time we learn something about the plague that throws an old idea out the window, it creates an entirely new problem of understanding. So there remains a great deal of work to do. And let me just mention first one thing in particular, which is that please don't talk about the Black Plague. It's the Black Death, or it's the plague, the bubonic plague, the pneumonic plague, the septicemic plague, the Black Death, but it's never the Black Plague. The first question that I want to deal with is whether or not the plague, the Black Death, really was the plague, specifically the bubonic plague and the pneumonic plague. That would mean the plague that is caused by the Bacillus Yersinia pestis, which is transmitted as a vector by the flea Xenocilla chiapis. You might think that this is kind of crazy. Of course, the plague was caused by the plague, but as a matter of fact, ever since 1984, there's been a great deal of doubt cast by critical historians about whether it was the plague, principally because there's some things that don't fit. The plague, the Black Death, which hits Europe in 1347 and 48, was so much more virulent, or seems to have been so much more virulent than any modern plague, any early modern plague. There are no signs of die-offs of rats, and since bubonic plague is often carried by rats, perhaps usually carried by rats in Western Europe and the United States, I should say Western Europe and China, the lack of a die-off of rats has raised suspicion. In fact, since 1998, there have been a number of genetic studies that sampled the DNA of bones, and in particular teeth, from victims of periods of plague that seem to have narrowed it down pretty much almost definitively to the conclusion that the Black Death of 1348-51 was indeed the bubonic plague. But all of the data, all of the samples that were excavated and tested were difficult to date, and none of them could be dated precisely to 1348-51 until a study that was published in 2011. In East Smithfield, a region, a little area just outside what was then London, across near the Tower of London, a graveyard, a cemetery was discovered. we actually have the pretty much the bill of sale that establishes when this cemetery was established, because the land was bought from a local convent. It was put into operation in 1348, and it went out of operation when the plague first began to hit London, and it went out of operation in the late 14th century. So pretty much everybody that was buried in that cemetery would have died at the height of the Black Death. Studies were run on 200, I think, of the 1,600 or 2,600 bodies that were buried there. And in fact, the bacillus that was extracted, or I should say the DNA that was extracted and reconstructed, was the bacillus Yersinia pestis, without any doubt. It's particularly interesting that it does not differ in any particularly marked way from contemporary or subsequent varieties of Yersinia pestis, which makes the particular virulence of the Black Death in 1348-51 still a problem to understand. Some scholars, both historians and epidemiologists, think that the bubonic plague remains today just as virulent as it was in the 14th century. There is one study that argues that without the intervention of antibiotics at the first onset of symptoms, a person who is infected with the bubonic plague will die in 40 to 70% of cases. Other historians and epidemiologists, probably the majority of them, believe that in fact the bubonic plague, the Black Death of 1348-51, there was something unusually virulent about it that distinguished it not only from all earlier plagues, but also all subsequent plagues. In any case, the Black Death was clearly caused by Yersinia pestis. One of the most interesting questions now is, where did the Black Death come from? Historians have always assumed that the Mongol conquests must have played a major, if not the major, if not the proximal causal, if not being the proximate cause of the Black Death. Because in the 13th century, the Mongols, beginning under Genghis Khan, conquered pretty much the entire, most of the Eurasian landmass. You see a map of it there. I might mention that the plague is endemic to this area here that's circled in blue, the Qinghai Tibet Plateau. That is where plague is endemic among the marmots that inhabit that area. And it's always been assumed that the Mongol conquest created a unified political sphere. And along with that unified political sphere came a trade network, which it was something that for the pre-modern period almost looks like a super highway of commerce, known, as you probably know, the Silk Road. And so everyone kind of assumes that the Black Death traveled along the Silk Road and that it moves continuously from the Qinghai Tibetan Plateau west into Europe and also east into China. There are, however, a lot of problems with this issue that make it really problematic. The first issue is that the Mongol conquests are largely a phenomenon of the 13th century, and in particular, they're largely a phenomenon of the first half of the 13th century. And the heyday of the Silk Road was also the 13th century, in particular, the middle and to the later part of the 13th century. So if the unification of Eurasia under the Mongols and the creation of the Silk Road under Mongol hegemony was the cause of the Black Death, the spread of the enabler of the spread of the bacillus across the Eurasian landmass, you would expect the plague to have happened in the 13th century, not the 14th century, not the second half of the 14th century. That's one problem. The second problem is that the Mongol Empire was always unstable and prone to fragmentation and disarray and civil war among the descendants of Genghis Khan. And it completely began to fall apart after the death of Genghis Khan's grandson, Mongke Khan, in 1259. At that point, the Mongol Empire disintegrates or fragments into at least 4 different khanates, which have not only have very little to do with each other, they actually hate each other, and they patrol their borders, which are somewhat vaguely defined, but they patrol their borders very, very carefully. And along with the fragmentation of the Mongol Empire into the different khanates, the Silk Road begins to disintegrate. And in fact, it's in the second half of the 14th century that the South China Sea Indian Ocean route begins to take prominence in international trade over the former Silk Road. So the Black Death is spreading at exactly the moment when the Silk Road is at its greatest disarray, and at the moment when the Mongol Empire is no longer a unifying force. Now, I mentioned that there's been a great deal of epidemiological work and genetic work on the DNA on the Bacillus Yersinia pestis, and this is one of the more splendid diagrams from a really quite fine article that illustrates the phylogenetic tree of Yersinia pestis. From this point here, when it split from its ancestor Yersinia pseudotuberculosis, which does nothing more except cause mild gastrointestinal illnesses in human beings. Unfortunately, it's fatal to fleas. You will see that here at what is labeled, here at N07, this node is the beginning of what epidemiologists call a palotomy, or a big bang, in which you have, in this case, a bacillus that suddenly begins to vary and split into a number of independent trees, into a number of independent sublineages. This is the lineage that ends up establishing plague in Western Europe in the late Middle Ages and the early modern period. This, the little brown maroonish triangles, that is the variant that causes the Black Death. And you can see that it occurs immediately after the Big Bang, immediately after the palotomy. The reason this is so interesting is that this palotomy, this moment at N07, can be pretty much dated to sometime between 1142 to 1339, and most likely to maybe 1196, or the most absolutely likely dating for this is generally thought to be 1268. In other words, 80 years before the Black Death appears. If you put all of these things together, you come up with this kind of argument. Do I want to go to that one yet? No. You come up with this kind of argument that what the Mongol conquests do is to seed Yersinia pestis throughout the territories of the Mongol Empire. And in introducing Yersinia pestis throughout the territories of the Mongol Empire, Yersinia pestis, the bacillus, has to adapt to new hosts. And it's in the adaptation to those new hosts that new variants appear. And so the Mongol conquests do not directly cause the Black Death. What they do is they create a kind of ecological melting pot, an ecological maelstrom, in which new variants of Yersinia pestis begin to appear, one of which is the one that caused the Black Death. In other words, this event occurs in the 13th century. All of the mutations are beginning to occur in the 13th century. And the moment, however, when the variant actually takes off in one particular species of rodent, the black rat, that is a mid-14th century event. Another difficult issue. Is exactly where the plague started. There is, for example, no very good evidence that it was ever in China. Some historians think that it definitely was in China, but there's no good evidence for its appearance in China until the 1640s. It may have appeared in the area of Kyrgyzstan, but the evidence for that has been destroyed, and therefore it's very hard to test. What is really astonishing is that we have incredible evidence, specific evidence, for the appearance of the Black Death pretty much everywhere in the Western Khanate known as the Golden Horde, or the Kipchak Khanate. It erupts in 1346 in all of these centers of the Golden Horde. And then it spreads. It actually, according to a recent argument, stabilizes in this region here of Kaffa and Tana. It actually stabilizes there through 1346 for a variety of reasons. And then in 1347, what happens is that a war between the Kipchak Khanate and the Genoese and the Venetians that had been fought in this particular region here is settled, and grain shipments begin. Grain shipments begin in September and October of 1347 from the northern edge of the Black Sea in the Crimean Peninsula and the mouth of the Don. And immediately the plague appears in Constantinople, Alexandria, Baghdad in 1348. It's in Cairo and Antioch and Tunis and Venice and Florence and Pisa, Marseille and Barcelona, and even London. Within 1 year, it is spread to all of these locations. The rapidity with which the Black Death spreads everywhere in Western Europe and throughout the Mediterranean is truly astonishing, and actually stands in marked contrast to the relative silence of evidence for its spread anywhere else in Eurasia. When I was a graduate student, believe it or not, 45 years ago, I certainly don't believe it, we had very few really good data on demography, and therefore very poor data on death rates from the bubonic plague. Everybody kind of assumed 30% was a good figure. 30% was a good figure because nobody could believe it could possibly have killed as many as 50%. But since then, especially in the last 25 years, we have increasingly good demographic data from very specific regions, very specific cities. And what is astonishing, as you see on your screen, is the range of death in the first years of the plague, 1348 to 51. And then, but just how high they can get, so that among the clergy in English benefices, between in this is, by the way, these are all English parishes, between 12% and 81% of the clergy died in the first years of the Black Death. Peasant tenants on the manors of the bishops of Winchester, between 20 and 80% of them died. So that now we believe that in fact it's quite possible that the Black Death killed at a minimum 30% of the population, and perhaps without any exaggeration at all, could easily have killed as much as 50% of the population of Western Europe. I think am I about out of time?
You've got a little more time, Geoff.
Let me get to one point that I want to make then, in particular. We often think of the Black Death as instigating, just as the medieval society as being impossibly unable to deal with this kind of calamity, and certainly it was. And we tend to think of medieval society as being lost in a mire of superstition and religious, not just religious bigotry, but religious ignorance. What is really quite interesting to me is that despite the fact that they couldn't understand anything of the pathology of the Black Death, there were things that they knew through observation and common sense. One of the things that they knew is that it was associated with old clothes, and it was associated with filth. And so, aside from the movements of flagellants that one finds in the first period of the Black Death, apart from the pogroms against Jews that again are found in the first stages of the Black Death, what is more striking, or equally striking to me, is the rationality within a contemporary society, within contemporary social and scientific possibilities, the common sensicality of them. So that, for example, civic ordinances of Pistoia in Italy in 1348 make perfect sense, and the same kinds of stipulations, regulations that one might make anywhere, so that they knew that the plague was brought from other cities, therefore prohibit entry from other cities. At that point, that became impossible because the plague was everywhere. So then they instituted prohibitions on leaving a city and leaving Pistoia, for example, and returning to it. There were prohibitions on importing old clothes and clothes that would be used for rags, because it was thought that rags and old clothing were a vector for the disease. There were restrictions on where and how one could dispose of carcasses, butchered carcasses and meat and dung. It was stipulated that the dead had to be put into coffins that were sealed, and nobody could visit the body save until that body, that cadaver, had been placed into a coffin. No one was allowed to visit the houses in which a person had died of the plague, including members of the own family. The cities of Italy paid individuals, very poor individuals from the poorest villages in the hinterlands, to come and enter the city and enter the houses and bring the bodies and bury them. So let me just end with that, which may be a surprise to you, because it certainly is, when I run across it as a surprise to me, is simply that there was a degree of commonsensical rationality with which they met the plague. And it may well be that elements of that commonsensical rationality continue into the second half of the 14th century and themselves lead to a diminution of the plague when the plague continues to return, as it does every 10 to 20 to 25 years until the 1600s. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Geoff. Our last presentation is by Elena Schneider, and it is entitled Smallpox and 1492, Myths, History, and Indigenous Survival.
All right. Thank you, Peter, and a special welcome to those of you joining us from far afield from the Bay Area. I guess it's a silver lining of this time. So go ahead and write in the chat where you are, if you're somewhere outside of the Bay Area, or even if you're here. I'm in the Bay. No, I'm not, actually. I'm joining you from Tenochtitlan, circa 1500. And as you can see behind me, this is a city of 250,000 people. You may know another city that sits on top of it today, that is Mexico City. In reality, I'm in my walk-in closet, but a girl can dream. And so I'm dreaming myself to Tenochtitlan, the land of the Mexica. The image behind me was painted by the Mexican artist Luis Covarrubias in 1964, and it was meant to evoke Tenochtitlan before Spanish arrival. You may recognize it because it hangs on a wall of the exquisite National Museum of Anthropology in Mexico City. Since the outbreak of the COVID-19 pandemic, we've heard a lot of analogies in the US media to the influenza pandemic of 1918. And we've also heard some mentions of the bubonic plague, but there has been less discussion in the press of pandemics that struck the Americas in the wake of Columbus's voyage in 1492. One of the few and most memorable references, to my mind, came on Twitter a year ago. Shortly after the 45th president of the United States announced a travel ban on visitors from Europe, the Cherokee writer and activist Rebecca Nagel had this to say on Twitter: "Look, I fully support banning travel from Europe to prevent the spread of infectious disease. I just think it's 520 years too late." She's obviously counting backwards to 1492. Some of you may remember this tweet, and you probably agree with me that it won Twitter for March of 2020. So what makes this tweet so fantastic? It may be obvious, but it forces the reader to adopt a Native American-centric historical perspective, a surprising twist that for many of us is painfully uncommon and even humorous, even though we live on Native land. But even more, it draws a parallel between COVID-19 and the infectious diseases that arrived in the Americas from Eurasia and Africa in the wake of Columbus's journey. So in so doing, it brings the Native American experience with disease into the mainstream of human experience, rather than treating it as a singular and tragic but inevitable result of Native Americans' unique immunological susceptibility and biological defenselessness. So it equates our experience as US citizens in 2020 with, for example, residents of Tenochtitlan in 1520. So I'm going to talk a bit more about the experience of Native peoples of the Americas with Eurasian and African diseases in the century after Columbus. And I'll focus on the Caribbean and Latin America, my areas of more expertise. But in particular, I want to highlight historians' quest to quantify and explain dramatic Native American population loss during the first century after Columbus. We're all living through this global pandemic, and I don't need to tell anyone on this webinar twice that disease operates within a social environment. Numerous political, economic, and societal factors shape disease outcomes. And yet, for far too long, even seemingly sympathetic historians of the Native Americas have allowed their findings to be impacted by pernicious narratives of Native American bodily weakness and racial inferiority. These are narratives that Native peoples tragically and yet naturally died out in the face of Eurasian and African diseases. These narratives have infected academic research and popular understandings to this day of the historical significance of 1492. One of the reasons that I love my job, and I love teaching in particular and working with graduate students, is that history constantly needs to be revised in light of all that we learn in the present. That work is unending. And it is my hope that this moment now that we are living through will inspire another generation of rising historians in my field to take on the history of epidemic disease and survival from a more Native American centric perspective, and to take a perspective that rejects centuries of racist assumptions about the genetic inferiority of Native American immune systems, and continue to emphasize resilience, adaptation, and survival. So the pandemic unleashed in the Americas during the century after Columbus's voyage, I mean, multiple pandemics, led to one of the most dramatic and painful population losses in world history. Diseases such as smallpox, measles, tuberculosis, influenza, and bubonic plague hit the Americas together in overlapping waves emanating outwards from the European invaders. There's no evidence that any human population in world history ever experienced the simultaneous arrival of so many highly virulent pathogens at once. So between 1492 and 1600, these multiple diseases, but especially smallpox, had a crucial impact on the most densely populated areas of the Americas, Mesoamerica, the Andes, and they also had a powerful impact on coastal Brazil and the Caribbean island of Hispaniola, what is now Haiti and the Dominican Republic. As you are all likely aware, disease helped shape the outcome of the Spanish conquest. It is believed that the first smallpox epidemic occurred in the Americas, occurred on the island of Hispaniola between 1518 and 1520. It actually arrived on one of the first slave ships to sail directly to the Americas from Africa. Smallpox is truly an awful disease. Google it. I refuse to show you pictures. I can't be responsible for your nightmares. It is caused by an inhaled virus that induces fever, vomiting, and a rash, what Carlos mentioned, a rash that soon covers the entire body with fluid-filled blisters. These blisters turn into scabs that leave scars, marking everyone who's lucky enough to survive with these scars all over their face and their body for the rest of their life. In approximately 1/3 of cases, it is fatal. Another third of those affected with the disease typically develop blindness afterwards. In Africa and Eurasia in 1492, it was endemic, and periodic outbreaks created a substantial and frequently replenished pool of people who had acquired immunities. So their helpful antibodies were often gained in early childhood when survival rates from the disease were better. In the Americas before 1492, no one had prior exposure to smallpox, and populations were thus more vulnerable. Smallpox broke out, and I'm going to show you, a slide again. Smallpox broke out in Tenochtitlan in 1520. These are images from the Florentine Codex of smallpox victims. Shortly after Cortez, who traveled there from the Caribbean, had taken Moctezuma captive with the help of his Tlaxcalan allies. And this is an account, I'm actually going to skip it in the interest of time, but it's an account of smallpox outbreak among the Maya from one of these annals that was co-written by Spaniard working with Maya informants. So they talk about the small and large sores and the extent of the disease and how it caused people to flee to the fields. And then here, this is an image from Peru from later than the 16th century, but it's an image of a woman afflicted by smallpox. In Peru, smallpox arrived before Pizarro. It killed the Inca ruler, Huayna Capac, and it threw the empire into a succession crisis in civil war that Pizarro, the Spanish conquistador, ruthlessly exploited. During the 16th century, contemporary European observers commented on rapid Native American population loss and the effects of disease, though they didn't understand their own role in its spread. Oh, here's an image from Brazil of a shaman among the Tupi trying to deal with the disease as it's afflicting and people are grieving over the effects of disease. And then this image, which is sort of bad, is also an image of smallpox as recorded by the Frenchman Jean de Lery. Okay, so the Spanish Dominican friar Bartolome de las Casas estimated a 90% drop in the population of Hispaniola based upon his experience there. Before Las Casas's religious calling, he was a Spanish colonist and enslaver of indigenous Taino in Hispaniola and Cuba. Famously, he attributed the depopulation of the island not to infectious disease, but to the rapacious behavior of the Spanish conquistadors. His brief, back. This is a translated version of his account, a brief account of the destruction of the Indies as it was printed in England and London in 1689. So his account was printed throughout Northern Europe by Spain's Protestant rivals and helped launch the Black legend of the horrors of Spanish colonialism. We can never, I'm going to stop sharing for a second. We can never fully know the scale of the population loss in the Americas, though Las Casas was not that far off the mark of current estimates at 90%. He was talking about Hispaniola, but more broadly. Using archaeological and archival evidence, scholars now believe that between 1492 and 1600, the native population of the Americas was reduced by more than 90%. So that compares to what Geoff just showed us for Europe, facing the bubonic plague of 30 to 50% population decline. We have more than 90% estimated for the Americas. You have to remember also that the impacts were varied and population gains would also follow those initial losses. But places like Mesoamerica, the Andes, a more densely populated island like Hispaniola, and a place like California took a really brutal toll. So it wasn't until after World War II that a critical mass of scholars at research universities in the Americas began to research and debate the original population numbers of the Americas. So those numbers I gave you of about 50 million people reduced to 5 million people, those numbers have a long backstory of debate among demographers. UC Berkeley played a leading role in these debates. In the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, the historian Woodrow Bora and the physiologist Sherburne Cook here at UC Berkeley collaborated to produce new, dramatically higher population estimates for the Americas. Together, they founded what came to be known as the Berkeley School of Latin American History, something that Margaret, Becca, and I try to continue today, though in a wildly different version. They might be kind of appalled by us. Bora and Cook produced a new and much higher estimate for the original population of the Americas. They relied on Cook's knowledge of disease and Bora's research into early Spanish colonial documents, such as Spanish censuses, tribute lists, and missionary accounts, along with a healthy dose of speculation. Their aim was to show the sophisticated levels that Native American societies had attained and their comparable level of civilization as they saw it in comparison with Eurasia and Africa. Because their work attributed so much of native population loss to disease, unwittingly unleashed by European invaders, you can think of their work as also contributing to a white legend that counteracted Las Casas's black one of evil Spaniards like wolves attacking the sheep, the native people of the Americas, who were like defenseless sheep before the rapaciousness and greed of the Spanish conquistadors. The debates, Bora and Cook helped to spur a round of debates that were fiercely contested between the so-called high counters and low counters, looking at the population of the Americas before Columbus, and there was really no consensus. As you'll see from my PowerPoint, the range is really tremendous of the kinds of estimates that have been put forward. And, you know, we will never actually know, though a lot of us sort of converge on this estimate that I gave you, around 50 million. So then in 1976, the historian Alfred Crosby published an enormously influential article, and a concise one at just 10 pages, that invoked the concept of virgin soil epidemic to explain the dramatic nature of Native American population loss. I used to invoke this term, virgin soil epidemic, and my students' eyes would glaze over. Is this biology class or history? And now I say it and their eyes pop out of their heads. And that's no thanks to COVID-19. They know precisely what I mean. And they also know how terrifying such a thing can be. And they can empathize with Native Americans' predicament more than they did before. So without population sectors that had already developed antibodies, disease was able to run rampant among Native American communities in its path. There was no flattening this curve. Alfred Crosby invoked the principle of virgin soil epidemic in a nuanced way, downplaying the idea of Native American genetic weakness and emphasizing instead environmental factors that shape disease outcomes, such as a lack of childhood exposure, malnutrition, and the social chaos created by European colonization. And yet historians, even seemingly sympathetic ones, have adopted biology as a macro explanation for Native American population loss in a decidedly unnuanced way. And that is since the 70s when Crosby wrote that piece. The worst example is probably Alfred Crosby's great popularizer, the historian Jerry Diamond. In his 1997 Pulitzer Prize-winning book, Guns, Germs, and Steel, he argued that it was Native American biological difference, determined not by race, but by the contingencies of geography and history that conditioned their susceptibility to Eurasian disease. On one level, the book was actually well-intentioned. It meant to argue that it was geography and the contingencies of history, not innate racial difference, that doomed Native Americans to die of disease. And yet the book ends up relying on racial difference as an explanation for historical outcomes. And it offers this grand narrative of biological and geographical determinism, whereby Native peoples were naturally selected out of human history and Europeans in. Sadly, this kind of thinking had leaked into the work of even the most sympathetic scholars of Native American history, Richard White and Colin Calloway. This is for the graduate students. They both describe Native Americans as, quote, doomed to die. Here you have it, well, actually I'm gonna skip that. So, all right, already by the early 2000s, the historian of medicine, David S. Jones, wrote an article critiquing the use of virgin soil epidemics as an all-encompassing explanation for Native American population loss. He commented that immune systems don't operate in any such categorical, genetically determined way as Diamond and even Crosby seem to argue. Native American immune systems operated no differently than those of Europeans or Africans. This has been corroborated by contemporary investigation into populations of Native peoples in the Amazon during their first exposure to measles. Their immune systems work like anyone else. It was really just the number of people who had had childhood exposure that would have made the difference about how a disease ran through a community. So as David S. Jones also pointed out, there's something disturbingly familiar and suspicious about this whole concept of the Americas as immunological virgin soil. The trope of the Americas as a new world and its inhabitants as helpless sheep, or worse, virgins waiting to be impregnated by Europeans propagating their seed. Sorry. This whole narrative is exhaustingly familiar. It should raise historians' alarm bells. And fortunately, there are deeply problematic reasons so many non-native scholars and thinkers found this explanation so intuitive and embraced it wholesale. Finally, historians of medicine have also pointed out more recently how these kinds of arguments about the contrast between weaker Black or brown or red bodies in comparison with stronger European ones are also disturbingly familiar. They've been used in other places with more immediately obvious racist intent, such as apartheid South Africa, where white doctors tried to argue that Africans were genetically more susceptible to tuberculosis to try to deflect the possibility that their working conditions in the mines, for example, were dangerous to their health. So much more, as historians of medicine pointed out, much more decisive than supposed genetic immunological factors were environmental ones, like malnutrition, which has an enormous impact on the outcomes of disease. Measles, for example, suppresses the immune system. So if measles have moved through a community, that makes them more vulnerable to another disease that enters that same community. Any factor that causes mental or physical stress can increase susceptibility to disease. That includes displacement, warfare, drought, destruction of crops, soil depletion, overwork, slavery, yes, slavery, malnutrition, social and economic chaos, depression, and trauma. These same factors decrease fertility, preventing a population from quickly replacing its losses. So to argue that Native peoples were naturally more susceptible to Eurasian and African diseases, and this is why they died out, is to diminish the impact of other factors, such as famine, war, slave raiding, and disruption to the traditional environmental and life and food ways of Native peoples of the America. And of course, this is to deflect claims of European responsibility for the tremendous impact of disease. I'll just say, I know my time's up, so just to wrap it up, I'll say that in recent years, few scholars in my field have really wanted to touch the topic of disease. They've often worked on Native survival and continuity, or they've worked on those other factors, Indigenous slave raiding, the environmental impact of the Spanish arrival. And they've really not touched as much the topic of disease. And why are these narratives of the devastation of disease so anathema to people in my field? Well, clearly they come across as narratives of biological inevitability that deflect responsibility. And also they contribute to an ongoing myth of Native extinction, an exhausting myth. They allow Jennifer Lopez to sing "This Land Is My Land" at the recent presidential inauguration. They make Rebecca Nagel's tweet not immediately apparent and self-evident, but surprising and humorous. And they make Taino activists in the Caribbean have to repeat until they are blue in the face, "We are still here." So I've tried to show here a little bit of what the possibilities of the present moment present to help us refine how we understand the past. I think our experience of this present moment allows us to pull the historical experience of Native Americans in the 16th century into the mainstream of human experience, rather than leave it as a tragic outcome of the contingency of human history. Okay, thank you.